All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to follow up on a request that we've heard from many of you, namely to begin to address the emerging HR issues related to the availability of the COVID vaccine, in particular now because educators in both New York and Connecticut are eligible to receive it. I'm Anna Hall. I'm the CEO of the Northeast Charter Schools Network, and we are so grateful to be joined again by Amy Bess, Chair of Better Price's Global Labor and Employment Practice Group, and a member of the firm's board of directors. Amy has practiced in the area of labor and employment counseling and litigation for more than 30 years, which she must have started when she was 10. Representing employers. Yeah, that's right. Representing employers of all sizes in a variety of industries, including education, professional services, nonprofits, government contractors, and retailers. Amy presented a similar session back at the end of July on HR and labor issues related to COVID, and we heard from many of you that it was an invaluable resource then and at many points over the course of the fall. So Amy, thank you again so much for joining us. As I'm sure you're aware, and I'm sure that you've heard in your work with some charter schools, there continue to be a lot of questions and concerns from both school staff and leadership related to fair and consistent support for staff who are either medically vulnerable or who have anxiety in the context of COVID. The need to balance what is fair and legal with schools' commitments to students and families to be open to the extent that it's safe and practicable has been one of the largest challenges for schools in these difficult times. And now, new development, ultimately a positive one, that educators are eligible to receive the COVID vaccine. So we've received a lot of questions related to the vaccine that would love to get your thoughts on. And then we will turn to questions from schools in the Q&A. So schools, please use the Q&A feature to add any questions, and we'll get to them after we tee up a couple that we've already heard from folks. So Amy, could you start off by talking about the EEOC update that was released in December related to the vaccine? Because I think that's kicked off a lot of this. And so if you don't mind, if you could also like break that all the way down. What is the EEOC? What authority does it have over charter schools? What was this announcement and how did it sort of get this whole ball rolling in some ways?
Sure. Well, thank you, Anna, for inviting me back. I really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun to be here, and I'm happy to address that. So the EEOC is the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they are the federal agency that is charged with having jurisdiction over a number of federal discrimination laws. And there are similar agencies that are at the state and some even at the local level. So in New York, there's a New York State Human Rights Department, and there's a New York City Division of Human Rights as well. So there are, and they have similar jurisdiction and responsibility as the federal EEOC does, but they are specifically chartered with governing the or implementing the city human rights law, and on the state level, the state human rights law, whereas the EEOC is charged with enforcing the federal discrimination laws, specifically the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is something we're going to talk about today because that really implicates the vaccine issue. And also Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which covers discrimination based on race and gender and religion, which is a particular area that is also germane to the vaccine, which we'll talk about a little bit. And so in over time and during COVID, the EEOC has updated its guidances. It had issued a guidance way back during the H1N1 epidemic, and then has sort of continued to update that periodically. And it has updated it from time to time during COVID with regard to whether or not employers could ask about medical or health-related symptoms. For instance, when an employee comes into work and employers have very now at what has become routine asked them to fill out a questionnaire or asked for information about their symptoms before they're going to be allowed to come into work. The question was whether that was an inappropriate disability related inquiry that was governed by certain very strict protocols, in that if it's a medical inquiry, it has to be job related and consistent with business necessity. And that's a particularly somewhat rigorous analysis that an employer has to enter into. But what the EEOC had said previously was employers can take temperatures and they can ask questions about an employee's health-related symptoms because we are in the midst of a global pandemic. And there is a direct threat. The key is there a direct threat? And the EOC recognized that there was a direct threat of having someone in your workplace who was potentially, infected with COVID, who could then potentially infect other members of your workforce. So that was something the EOC has said over time. It evolved. It has updated its guidance yet again in December. I think it was December 16th, and this one related specifically to the fact that the FDA had issued the emergency use authorization for the two vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. And so a lot of employers had been asking, well, can we require the vaccine? Can we actually mandate our employees to take the vaccine? And so that was really why the EOC felt a need to come back out with yet another update to address some of the specific issues. And interestingly, I think on some level, surprisingly, the EOC said, yes, the employers can technically require their employees to take the vaccine. But the big question really is, should they require it? And the main reason, I think, to really think long and hard about whether you should require the vaccine is because there are some very specific legal accommodations or legal exemptions that employees may be entitled to in response to a mandate by an employer, for instance, that they take the vaccine. One is specifically, if someone has a disability that would be recognized under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is frankly not a very high bar in terms of what constitutes a disability. And if that disability would actually make getting the vaccine more complicated for their health situation, either they would have an adverse reaction to the vaccine, or their doctor has simply told them they cannot get the vaccine for health-related reasons, and they would be entitled potentially to a reasonable accommodation and not have to take the vaccine potentially. Now, whether or not the employer could actually provide a reasonable accommodation, that's another question. We can certainly get into that. But an alternative to the vaccine, for instance, could be that particular employee might be required to wear masks, social distance, if in fact that could be an adequate alternative to getting the vaccine. Another alternative accommodation that might be available would be remote work. If the person would pose a serious risk in the workplace, but they could do their job remotely, then remote work might be a reasonable accommodation in lieu of getting the vaccine. Now, in the school environment, if the school is back in the building and is no longer doing remote schooling, then your staff member is a teacher, remote work is probably not a reasonable accommodation. And so that creates a whole nother sort of can of worms that we certainly can talk about. Another area that an employee might respond with in terms of their response to a mandatory vaccine program would be if they have a sincerely held religious belief that prohibits them from getting the vaccine. And there certainly are religious beliefs that would be opposed to a vaccine, a vaccination program. So that's another way that an employee could respond and say, I can't get the vaccine because of my religion. My religion prohibits that. And then a third area would be pregnancy, and if an employee is pregnant and their physician has said that getting the COVID vaccine would be detrimental to their health or complicate their pregnancy, that would be another way that an employer would be required potentially to at least explore a reasonable accommodation instead of a vaccine. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what the EEOC's updated guidance talks about. It talks about how an employer is expected to kind of navigate these exceptions, and at the same time, if it chooses to have a mandatory vaccine program, still do that within the confines of the law. Another question that was raised and it essentially addressed is whether or not an employer could, in lieu of requiring the vaccine, or in addition to requiring the vaccine, mandate that employees disclose whether they've had the vaccine. So require that employees just reveal whether they've had the vaccine, and basically reveal their vaccine history. Again, that whole issue about whether or not that's a prohibited disability inquiry or prohibited medical inquiry was addressed by the EOC, and the EOC said, no, it's not a prohibited inquiry. Employers are entitled to ask those questions, provided they don't go further. So you could ask, have you had the vaccine? But if the employee says no, you can't say why, because then you would be basically eliciting information potentially about a disability or about their religion or that kind of thing. So it's a bit complicated, but the bottom line for employers is, yes, you can require the vaccine, but because there are so many exceptions, it may or may not be a good idea for a lot of employers to require it. I think what most employers are doing, and we've seen this with most of our clients, frankly, including healthcare clients, interestingly enough, is that they're strongly encouraging the vaccine. They are making the vaccine available and trying to reduce barriers to getting the vaccine. So paying a copayment if there's a copayment. There are even healthcare providers that are clients of ours who have offered financial incentives to their employees to get the vaccine. I know of a hospital that's offering $500 to each employee who gets the vaccine. They don't want to force employees to get it, but they want to strongly encourage them to get it. So,
wow. Yeah, that's great to hear, or that's really interesting. Before I move on to another sort of category of questions, just looking at the Q&A because it's topical right now, there's a question that an employer can require the vaccine even though it is not technically approved by the FDA right now.
Well, that's an interesting question. We've taken the position that the employer can. I have read other guidances out there from other law firms and from other experts who have said, because the emergency use authorization actually requires that you fill out a form that says this is voluntary, which is it's voluntary in connection with the providers of the vaccine. So through Pfizer and Moderna. Some people have said that really means that the employee really has to consent. But because employers can have conditions, job-related conditions that they impose, I believe that an employer actually can require the vaccine. But again, because you have these exceptions, I'm not 100% convinced that mandating the vaccine is actually a good idea right now. But I do think, the EOC has said in its recent guidance that employers can require it. And the guidance was written at a time when the only vaccine that had been approved was the emergency use authorization vaccines. So I think if the EOC had wanted to say, but not right now, because all you have is this EUA, they would have said it.
Yep, that makes sense. So now that educators have access to the vaccine, recognizing that in many cases that access is sort of like technically true, but like actual access continues to be a challenge. What thoughts do you have for schools that have been accommodating either medically at-risk staff or even just those who have personal preferences or anxiety about returning to school? Is there a point where schools can or should withdraw those accommodations if someone is unwilling to become vaccinated in order to return to work? And so if so, how and when?
Well, we get this question a lot because there was a long period of time during the early stages of the pandemic when workplaces were simply closed and everybody was working remotely. And that included people that really could perform their duties from home pretty effectively, and those who really were struggling to perform their duties from home effectively. And frankly, there were lots of people who weren't really performing their duties at all from home because their job was a receptionist or secretary or something, that just really wasn't doable from home. And so the question was, now that our workplace has reopened, can we require that those people come back to work and physically come to the workplace as long as we've taken all the precautions and steps that are recommended by the CDC and other health, public health agencies to ensure that our workplace is safe, wearing masks, social distancing, and that kind of thing. And as long as someone does not have a disability that requires them to be entitled legally to a reasonable accommodation, which might include remote work, then yes, employers can require employees to return to the workplace. And the fact that you have previously allowed those employees or even required those employees to work from home is not going to be an argument that is going to preclude you from saying, well, our workplace is now open, and so we're no longer allowing sort of unlimited remote work. We have to have our workplace back. We have to have our employees back in the workplace. With regard to the vaccine, once the vaccine becomes readily available, I think that strongly encouraging employees to get the vaccine. And if they refuse to get the vaccine and they don't have a legal reason not to have the vaccine, then you still have to explore. If they have a disability or pregnancy or need a religious accommodation, certainly you need to engage in sort of an individualized analysis as to whether or not you can accommodate that. But even if they meet one of those criteria, you still don't have to allow them to work remotely if remote work is not going to enable them to perform the essential functions of their job. So in the context, for instance, of a teaching position where all of the students are back in the building and the teacher just is unwilling to get the vaccine, doesn't have a legal reason for not getting the vaccine, religion, pregnancy, or a disability, but simply is just afraid to get the vaccine, doesn't want to get the vaccine, maybe has political objections to the vaccine. Remote work, when all of that teacher students are in the building, is not going to be an option. And that person legally is not entitled to a reasonable accommodation because they don't meet any of those legal exceptions. And so the question is, what can you do with that employee? And technically, you can require them to come back. And if they refuse to come back, then you can say that's the end of your employment relationship. This is your job, requires you to be in the building. We need you to be there. And if you cannot be in there safely, we can't employ you. So those are difficult decisions to make, but that's definitely an option.
Yeah, and I know so many schools and leaders are wanting to be as, sort of humane and generous and supportive as they can in these moments. But I think as things go on and on, it becomes harder and harder. And especially this context of like, if you have the opportunity to get the vaccine and you elect not to, then at what point?
There may be consequences. Yeah, there may be consequences. Yeah.
So want to move into this category of collective bargaining. And I'm going to use a question from Stacy in the Q&A to do the jumping off there. But then would also love, and so her question is, if a school is unionized, does mandating a vaccine need to be negotiated? But then in our earlier conversation, you had some really, I think, important insights about some considerations that schools should have around protected behavior related to these issues. So if you could speak to that as well.
Sure. Yeah, the question is a good one about if a school is unionized, does the collective bargaining agreement require that you bargain with the union over whether or not to mandate vaccines? And it's a really good question. It's going to come down to what the provisions of your collective bargaining agreement actually say. There's usually a provision in a collective bargaining agreement called management rights. And if you've negotiated a broad management rights provision, you will have the employer should have some pretty broad rights to implement policies, procedures, and protocols that are going to be necessary and essential to protecting the health, safety, and welfare of your workplace. So it's going to have given the employer a broad amount of discretion in terms of implementing certain things that are necessary to. So if like the building is on fire and you need to send everybody home, you're not going to have your management right clause is going to allow you to send everybody home and not have to call the union to negotiate over it. So that's one possibility. I am not a traditional labor lawyer, so I usually consult with one of my colleagues, and we have a number of colleagues who are, and so they have shared with me that they believe that even if your management rights clause in your collective bargaining agreement is broad enough that it would allow you to implement a mandatory vaccine program, before you do that, it is a good idea to pick up the phone and call your union rep and talk to them about it. They will likely agree that it's a good idea, but it is something that it just in an abundance of caution, and also just to preserve, union and management relationships, that it's a good idea to talk about it. Whether you certainly don't need to concede that you have to get their approval, but you still would want to potentially engage in a dialogue. So that's just, I think, a good idea. And if someone is questioning whether their management rights clause is even broad enough to allow you to do that, you probably should talk to your outside labor lawyer just to make sure what your, kind of what your best next steps look like. With regard to non-unionized workplaces, and I think most charters are going to be non-unionized, the National Labor Relations Act is a broad federal statute that actually governs both unionized and non-unionized workforces. And there's a section of the National Labor Relations Act, that Section 7, which actually protects employees who are not in a union, as well as employees who are in a union, who engage in what's called protected concerted activity. And that's essentially, it's essentially communications, sort of coordination, if you will, with other employees. So more than one employee banding together to advocate or to raise concerns to the employer about particular workplace conditions. And when the employees do that, they're engaged in protected activity, and you cannot discipline them, terminate them, demote them, penalize them in any way, because that is protected activity, whether they're in a union or not. And obviously, originally the idea was they could be getting together to talk about the need for a union. So they're engaging in potentially organizing activity, but it has over time been broadened to include really anything that is designed to address a workplace concern, raise concerns about workplace safety, dangers, discrimination, or advocate for some sort of improvement in the workplace. And so certainly if a group of employees gets together and says, this is outrageous, we think it's crazy that our employer is mandating this vaccine and we're not going to do it, and we think this is, a violation of our rights, that could be considered protected activity. That would be where employers should not, certainly without legal advice, should not be disciplining or terminating or taking some adverse action against those employees.
Yeah, I want to link that to, so maybe I'll come back to a question that I have for you also about how schools should be thinking about this sort of season, if you will, where they're making staffing decisions, they're looking ahead. So let me ask the question and then I'll ask the follow-up, because I think that there's my experience in having conversations with lots of the school leaders who are listening right now is that there's a familiar vocal minority that, and I say familiar because I think it's similar. Lots of schools are having sort of the same challenges with folks who don't have necessarily a specific medical reason to not want to be back in person, but are sort of very insistent about their concerns. So, do you have recommendations for schools as they have conversations with staff about contracts and returning or not returning, as the case may be, for the 21-22 school year? And so in particular, if schools are contemplating not renewing any contracts, is there anything that you would suggest that they sort of uniquely consider in these moments? So for example, if they are having these thoughts about someone who maybe has been very reluctant to return in person, for example.
Yeah, it's a challenge because you have to be careful about whether or not employees are sort of engaging in this protected concerted activity, which we just talked about, where groups of employees, it's really, and a group can actually be more than one employee. So it's not, you don't have to have like a big mass of employees who are meeting privately to talk about, how concerned they are with the workplace policy. and distinguish that from a situation where an individual employee has just been a naysayer about reopening the building, has criticized every single thing that the employer does, has really refused to be cooperative and to be on board with the idea that we need to be back in the buildings, we need to be educating our kids in person, has been, very vocal about how they disagree with that. Whether or not, I mean, whether or not you want to take action specifically based on that behavior, or whether or not you're looking at that behavior as part of an overall pattern of performance, I do think that that's an acceptable consideration to take into account as you're analyzing the overall picture in terms of making the renewal decision for that particular employee. Because the reality is that the pandemic is not going away anytime soon. Even with the availability of vaccine for educators, you're still going to have a long runway before students are going to be able to be vaccinated. One of the vaccines is only available for people 16 and over. The other one is only available for people 18 and over. And it's probably not going to be until the end of 2021 that we're going to have any kind of widespread or wide-scale availability of the vaccine for younger kids. Even if then, I don't know, because they still have to do the clinical testing. So we have a long runway to get through. Everyone really has to work together, be on board, and be supportive of the school's initiatives in terms of whatever is in the best interest of the students and how those decisions have been made. So I'm a believer that those considerations certainly should be taken into account in terms of whether employees are really on board with the game plan and the strategic plan to get our kids educated. Again, this protected concerted activity is that nuance. It's not a black and white test. It's one of those things where if you've got a question, this might be one of those you want to run by outside counsel, because each of these situations is going to require somewhat of an individualized assessment, and it's not a one size fits all. So it's you have to be careful, but I do think these are support for the school's initiatives to get kids educated in person is an important consideration to factor in here.
And that actually made me think of a question that we didn't discuss in advance. So hopefully I'm not throwing a real wild card out there. As schools are sort of drafting contracts or any other letters of agreement, anything else that's sort of formalizing the relationship for 21, 22, or maybe even sooner, is there anything that you would say, is it reasonable for schools to think about adding a clause related to any of these things, right? Like our goal is to be in person to the largest extent possible. And, part of signing on for next year is recognizing that, or is that going too far?
It's a really interesting idea, Anna, and it's not, I'm not certain that I would probably say, have a contractual obligation that you will be in person, because you can't possibly anticipate all of the, the sort of exceptions or what ifs, hypothetical possibilities that might arise. But having a general statement in the agreement that the employee signs on to, that is sort of like a statement of philosophy, if you will, is one kind of additional indicator that the employee has been on notice, has been put on notice. So I think it's a great idea to have a general philosophical statement about something like, we believe that educating our kids in person is our absolute goal, and to the extent we can do so safely and effectively, this is our highest priority to do so. Even saying you acknowledge that this is our philosophy, this is our our belief. I don't see a problem with that. It doesn't mean that you will not make exceptions, as you're obligated to do under the law if an employee has a specific situation that justifies and requires that kind of an accommodation. So I think it's a good idea. I hadn't actually thought of that, but I will be working on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, now's the time, friends. Take every opportunity as long as you're documenting things. Well, so let's turn to some questions that we have in the Q&A. So the first one, and apologize, we're probably going to ping around a little bit. So if you strongly encourage vaccination, but it's not mandatory, can you ask for proof of vaccination, like the actual vaccine card, or just sort of an honest broker yes or no?
Can you ask for the vaccine card? I have not seen that. I have to confess, I have not seen the vaccine card. I have not gotten the vaccine yet, but so I don't know if there's any information on there that would be
proof yeah. As opposed to just like Scouts honor.
Yeah, I mean,
I got it.
I'll caveat my answer by saying, if the vaccine card only says the date and whether or not they've received the vaccine, and it has some sort of official sort of indicator on it, then I would say that requiring a copy of the vaccine card is probably fine. Where I would be concerned is if it reveals any additional information. There's another statute out there that is called GINA, it's the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and so you don't want to ask any questions or get any information that would sort of invade sort of genetic information or disability related information. So I don't think anything like that would be revealed on the vaccine card. So I think that's okay. The other thing you could do is just ask them to certify. They have to sign something that certifies that they have received the vaccine. The reason why I think that's okay, and it's still not necessarily part of a mandatory vaccine program, it's still something you're strongly encouraging, is if someone has not had the vaccine and you as an employer have determined that it's really important to protect the safety and the health of all of your workforce and your students, that people have the vaccine, you may need to make decisions with regard to someone who has not had the vaccine in terms of what duties and responsibilities they might be able to do safely. Or you may need to make really take special precautions for them with regard to PPE, masking and social distancing. And if they are the school nurse, or they're somebody who has lots of really close physical contact as part of their duties with students, you may decide that somebody who hasn't had the vaccine is really not going to be able to do all of those duties and responsibilities effectively and safely. So having information about whether someone has had the vaccine is as an employer is still something that I think is, even in the absence of a mandatory vaccine program, is still something that an employer may want to know.
That makes me think, going back to this idea that, 'tis the season for thinking about future staffing. What about asking prospective employees to disclose either whether or not they've had it or their planfulness to receive it when they have, when it's, when there's an appointment for them, for example? Is that something you could ask a prospective employee? So imagine you're hiring a school nurse or a PE teacher, and you're imagining this person's going to work for us for, a long, long time. And this is something that we're going to feel like, is it really important to their ability to do, to do their job? Is that something that folks could ask to be disclosed before they're even an employee?
I think it is. I do think it is, especially if the employer has made a determination that the maximum vaccine population in their school is their absolute highest and best ability to keep their school population safe. I don't know that I've had an employer ask me that question yet, and so, but based on everything that I have seen and read, I feel comfortable with that, with that being a prospective question. As long as you're not following it up and asking, if they say, why not? If they say no, and you're asking them why, do you have a disability? What is your religious, belief, that kind of thing at that point in time.
And we all know not to ask a prospective employee if they're pregnant, so.
Exactly. So, yeah. So
that makes sense.
I'm comfortable with that.
Well, and so that, I think that links to a question that's in the Q&A. And so just asking for the sake of completeness, and so that Jordan, who asked it, sort of hears it asked and answered. So he writes, I heard Amy say you can ask if someone has had the vaccine, but that if they have not yet had it, you can't ask why not. So can you ask whether or not they plan on getting it?
Yes, I would be comfortable asking if they plan on getting it. Yes,
And just not probing if they say no.
yes.
Yeah.
You know, it's a complicated issue because it's hard to have an inquiry with an employee that is not, that doesn't go beyond that. And so that's where I think employers are going to struggle a little bit, because when someone says no, they haven't had the vaccine, and no, they don't plan on getting it, then what do you do with that? Do you then say, well, you can't work for us, or you make a decision perhaps that they can't work in a role that would require them to be in close physical contact with students or with other staff, where masks and social distancing may just not be a good alternative. So it's a little bit challenging, because it's not entirely clear that employers are going to say, if we have a vaccine program now, all of our educators are going to be eligible to get it, that they're going to be comfortable necessarily going back to sort of allowing employees as an alternative to wear masks and social distance.
Yeah, and that relates to a couple of questions that are in the Q&A, that I think I just want to give sort of a little bit of a voiceover before I ask them, which is, we're talking about today, tomorrow, next month, the next 6 months, the end of this academic year. But I think, really want to push folks to think further in the future as well. So, for example, um, um, Sheila asks, if we don't mandate the vaccine and some people don't get it, when we reopen 100%, how will we keep everyone safe? They can't wear a mask indefinitely. And I think, Sheila, not to put words in Amy's mouth, that's what she's saying too, right? Like, this is why figuring out whatever you can do to encourage folks to get it is going to be your best approach, because you can't wear masks indefinitely.
Yeah, and the thing, I think what we're recommending to employers, and we're seeing with a lot of employers that are facing employees who are really reluctant right now, it's really a question of kind of education and information. I think there's just a lot of uncertainty right now because it's so new, and frankly, there's still a lot of questions about the vaccine. For instance, people are still not 100% sure. I don't know that anyone is sure whether or not once you get the vaccine, you will be, kind of at least 95% or whatever the statistics are, 95% free of getting, or risk-free of getting COVID indefinitely, or if there's going to be some need at some point down the road to get a booster shot or something like that after you've gotten your two doses. Another question is, could someone still get it and potentially be a transmitter of the disease without necessarily having any symptoms and being actually negatively impacted themselves? I don't know that we know that either. So there are a lot of questions out there about the vaccine that are still unanswered, and I think that's leading to a lot of people's skepticism and uncertainty about it, which I think employers, one in addition to strongly encouraging, possibly incentivizing employees to get it, sharing information as soon as it becomes available, and providing, even maybe an internal seminar on the vaccine with a local health professional that will answer questions for employees about it, to sort of help them resolve their questions or their fears. That may be a good strategy for trying to address some of the resistance to it over time.
I think that makes sense. And if anyone out there is hearing that and think that's something that they'd like help to do, let us know. Another question, can schools create an anonymous poll to gauge the team members who plan to get vaccinated?
There's nothing there's nothing wrong with that I see. I mean, you're not actually identifying individuals by, by name and tying it to them. You're just essentially sort of testing the waters and trying to get a sense of people's general comfort level and likelihood of getting the vaccine, so that you can make decisions and plan. It's not that different, frankly, from many workplaces, including my own, that sent out a poll back in, I think it was May or June, July, something like that, about whether or not you did, and this was anonymous, whether you had a reason for being concerned about returning to the physical workplace. And did you have a family member who was at high risk for COVID that you were concerned about, or were you personally at high risk for COVID? This was all information that was submitted anonymously, but it was just, we were just doing this poll to get a general sense of a lay of the land in terms of planning on, when we would be really relatively safe to consider reopening the offices. So
That makes
I think
sense.
that's fine.
So it sounds like Jonathan asked a question, if we're offering paid time off to get vaccinated, can we request documentation? And I'll be honest and say, when I first read this, I think, Amy, it was when you were talking about the healthcare group that was offering $500 as an incentive. So I read it as an incentive, but which could be an interesting thing to offer people. But I think he means if they're saying, if you get a vaccine appointment, drop what you're doing, you get the time off to go get it. Can they request documentation either before, in order to confirm that that is in fact, why they need the time off, or after confirming that they have received the vaccine?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I'm comfortable with that. Oops, you're on mute, Anna.
Doesn't matter how many of these I've done or how many months I've been on Zoom, I still do it every once in a while. So let me pose this question, and I'd love your thoughts, because I have some as well. I don't know how sort of global of a question this is, but we've heard some similar questions. So the New York City DOE passed guidance that teachers who are currently teaching remotely should wait for vaccines in order to allow the in-person staff to get vaccinated. We've passed this guidance on to our staff and received pushback in terms of that there is no guidance from the state or the Department of Health. So they feel that it's unfair to hold them back. So I'm going to agree with the question and say, right now the state's guidance is about 1A and 1B eligibility, and that's very clear on their website. And anyone who meets that eligibility, which you first determine on the state website, and only after it establishes your eligibility are you able to schedule an appointment. From there on, it's fair game. And I think that there are lots of people who have opinions within those categories. And we do know of one county Department of Health that has structured its own internal system to prioritize within the 1B category. But besides that, if you go on the website, the state website, and you're eligible and there is an appointment, you can book it. Whether or not you personally feel morally compelled to wait so that other potentially more impacted folks can go, I think that's a personal decision and not necessarily an organizational one. Amy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with the sort of thought process and the decision-making rubric that you just sort of outlined, Anna, because I again, it may be a suggestion that is being made to try to sort of manage the flow of patients, but I don't, the two, the 1A and the 1B categories are very clear. And if someone falls into the 1B category and they are now eligible, they should be entitled to get the vaccine. And just because they happen to be working remotely right now, that is certainly not going to be a long-term situation, hopefully. And it just doesn't seem fair, frankly. And nor is this, it sounds like a guidance that is absolutely prohibiting them from getting the vaccine. It's simply a suggestion, it sounds like, which again, I think once they're entitled to get the vaccine, they should, and they want the vaccine, they should get the vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we have a school here that says they've decided to remain 100% virtual through June 2021 for the school's academic program. However, they're preparing to administer the New York State exams in the spring. And Amy, I'll add a little bit of background here. The New York State Department of Education has not yet issued a formal decision about whether or not those exams will be administered, but they have said very clearly that the exams will only be administered if they can be administered in person, for equity issues, but also because, quite frankly, the state is not equipped at this moment to administer massive virtual or electronic state testing. But this person is asking, could they require all employees report to the building? And I think in the context, they're saying potentially to administer the state test, but I think you could pick sort of any reason, right? If they wanted to have a staff professional development session, or there were other sort of programmatic reasons that they would have staff return, even if their instruction is still remote. Is that something that schools could do?
If the schools are remote out of their own choosing, or is this a particular,
It's out of their own choosing.
Yeah, it's not legally, right now it's not legally mandated by the local, like a local authority. We've had a lot of different employers who have had reasons to bring people back. Now, again, you have to be willing to and able to ensure that you can accommodate certain people who can't come back because they have a disability and they have a medical certification that would say that they are unable to come into a group setting because of their higher risk of COVID due to their underlying disability or because of a pregnancy. So that might require that you do something for those particular individuals as a legal matter from a reasonable accommodation standpoint, if that's possible. So as long as you're willing and able to engage in that one-on-one kind of interactive process with people who may need an accommodation and who can't legally come back because of their underlying condition, then there's no reason why you can't, on a case-by-case basis, require people to be physically in the building, even though as a policy matter you have been in a remote operation approach.
That makes sense. I think we've covered it. We did get a request in the chat. Are you willing can we share your contact information?
Absolutely.
Great.
Happy to chat with anybody who wants to reach out.
I will add that now. I should have this memorized. I will say there's no better person to have in your corner in these difficult situations, COVID or otherwise, than Ms. Amy Bess.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, I once described her as my candle in the darkness.
That's a very nice compliment.
And I cannot fully disclose why I say that, but for HR reasons, but I really stand by it. So I think we'll wrap. This has been recorded. It's available on our website. I just put Amy's contact information in the chat. And as things continue to evolve and things come up, schools, please feel free to let us know anything else that we can do. And potentially we'll ask Amy back for a second encore to her original performance last summer, which has been viewed repeatedly on our website. And so folks can also access that because she talks a lot about reasonable accommodations in the context of ADA, which is all still very relevant.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, everyone.
Great to see you. Bye-bye.
You well.